Technology executive Michael Guimarin helps large organizations, smaller groups, and individuals manage the overwhelming superabundance of information around us. In this, my first interview episode, we discuss the art of understanding known as sensemaking that he teaches. You can find out more information on his website, michaelguimarin.com, or follow him on Twitter at Michael Guimarin. Prejudice, ideology, bias, distortion, mindlessness. Bad thinking is everywhere. The world needs heroes to lead the way to better, higher, more valuable ways of thinking. These ways are timeless and never more needed than right now. Some claim that these timeless ways of thinking are now dangerous. To them I reply, beware of Wolf. And I'm here with Michael Guimarin. Michael Guimarin is a sense maker, and he teaches people sense making. So, Michael, I'd like you to start by telling me and our audience a little bit about what your educational background is, your professional background, because this is a very different thing for people to encounter. Most people haven't even heard of the term sense making. We'll get into that a little bit, but tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely, Wolf. Thank you. My family's been through a number of crises over the generations. And one thing that's stuck through those things is the importance of education. And so for my grandmother, for my mother, for me, education is one of those things that people can't take away from you. And from a very young age, we put a lot of energy into critical thinking and everything that goes along with education. And so I went to private schools from when I was 2 years old. And that culminated in getting 2 degrees from Princeton University, one in classics, which is the study of Latin and Greek, and another in psychology. And along that way, I also took classes at the local university, Stanford, on various topics, including computer programming, which I started doing when I was 11. From a professional background, when I got out of undergraduate, I went immediately into programming really large systems inside of a search engine. Incredibly impactful experience for me, and it was a way for me to learn programming really quickly. From that really big system where I worked on what today would be called continuous integration, continuous deployment, CI/CD, which you could think of as like you have a really big computer that's actually made up of a bunch of really small computers. And if you want to learn about it, you can read about Beowulf supercomputing. And my job was to write the software that watched all the really small computers so they would all add up into the big computers. And so I had this experience with dealing with all kinds of issues machine to machine in terms of communication, networking, this kind of thing. And then from there, I went to work for what's called a content delivery network. Now, content delivery network is a company that has servers all over the world, and it helps deliver information more quickly to end users. And the CDN that I worked for had about 2 to 3 billion users a month. So it's likely, if you're listening to this podcast, that you are one of my customers. And the companies that I worked with were companies like Twitter and Pinterest and Reddit. And so I got a lot of experience dealing with information delivery at scale, right? So I had the programming experience, and then I had all this experience working with customers. And then I wanted to go back to school. I'm a contrarian. And so I went back to school and got an MBA. Now you might be thinking, an MBA, that's not contrarian. And you have to understand, in my subculture here in Silicon Valley, people are very anti-MBA. They speak very negatively about it. And for me, I was like, oh, they're speaking so negatively about it, I should go learn more about it.
I like that.
And, yeah, exactly. And so I took that same mindset, right? And when I was in school, getting good grades was important, but what was more important for me was following my curiosity passions, right? So I talk about how my favorite class at school was Renaissance garden and landscape architecture design.
Okay.
And what's funny is I always try to pull in threads from those disparate art lessons into my work in computing, right? And you might be like, wow, this is like really kind of crazy, but you never understand what's going to happen where, right? And so keeping an open mind and being open to opportunity and being curious, and then really focusing on trying to learn as much as I can about as many things as I can has really set me up with a great foundation to be interested in a lot of stuff. And that sort of brings me to today, where I work less on technical problems today and more on how do we take the information that's existing inside companies or organizations and more efficiently use it to make better decisions at every level of the organization.
Awesome. So yeah, you mentioned in your bio, you mentioned telemetry, and you implied that managing telemetry is important down to individuals and smaller groups. Now, I can have a sense that telemetry is, all the information coming in from various sources, integrating that and understanding it in a way that people can make business decisions based on it. But what does telemetry mean in the context of individuals and smaller groups?
Yeah, I think telemetry, I just picked that word out of the air. You might call it metadata, which is data about data. So this thing happened over the last 50 years, which is basically any data that's interesting to a person is more or less free to access or to distribute, right? And so if you think about every website that you go on, every article that you read, every book that you read, getting a list of all those things is actually really trivial from a computer's perspective. And if you look at people like Jeff Bezos or Albert Einstein or whoever, and you were to say, here are all the things that one of those people read for their entire life, and here's the order, like people would love that, right? They'd be like, oh, this is why Jeff, started doing this at Amazon because he read this thing, right? And so when we think about telemetry, right, or when I think about it, I think about we're generating data constantly. And to store this data and do something with it later is more or less free. And so if it's going to be free, then it's going to be stored. And if it's going to be stored, then really smart people like Wolf are going to create algorithms to look at it and find patterns. And then we're going to learn things that are really surprising and things that are probably like, yeah, my grandmother could have told me that, right? And that's sort of what I mean by managing telemetry, and sort of everybody gives off so much data that there's like really interesting things that you can learn about people, right? For good or for ill.
Sure. And I guess that gets, obviously we're taking in all kinds of information about the world where most of us are in information overload. And I think that gets to the core of our conversation, which is, sense making itself. What would you say, what is a high level view of overview of sense making? You can talk about how the telemetry plays into that, but, sense making is the core of the conversation. So what is it and why is it so important?
Yeah. So sense making, in sort of like a phrase, is the art of understanding, right? And why is it important? It's like, well, we have to understand everything because we're just one small piece in a much larger puzzle. And there's been some changes in our media and information environment, which, as you said, Wolf, we all feel acutely, right? There's too much information. There's this abundance that we're dealing with, right? It's a fire hose. You look at the words that people use about it, they're very overwhelming. And because our information environment has changed, right? We're not reading newspapers every morning. We're reading Facebook news feeds or Twitter or whatever. We're listening to podcasts like this one instead of the radio. Then the way that we understand both ourselves and our place in the world has to change, right? Just fundamentally, right? And like, to put things into perspective, there's this really great statistic that's apocryphal, but it's like directionally accurate, right? And it goes something like this. A week's worth of New York Times articles contains just as much information as someone was likely to experience in their lifetime in the 17th century and before.
Wow.
And so when it's like, exactly, wow. When I think about that, I'm like, oh my God, this is crazy how much we have to deal with, right? it's it's like ours are problems of abundance, not scarcity. So,
Right. Well, I guess we live in a post-scarcity society, at least information-wise, right?
yeah.
So obviously we're trying to figure out these coping strategies to deal with the situation that I guess is, unique in human history that we find ourselves facing, these past couple generations are facing. So what's at stake if we don't learn better sense making? What's going wrong right now that points to the need to develop this skill?
Yeah. I sort of look at it a couple of ways, right? So one way that's interesting is you ask what's going wrong, right? And if you think about your life and you think about the things that you've eaten in your life, we all know that you need to eat a balanced diet. And that maybe is like, whole foods that your great great grandmother would recognize, right?
Mm-hmm.
So not super processed and packaged, and vegetables and meats and all this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see someone who's like, I'm going to go and I'm just going to eat donuts every single day, right? They get sort of sick, right? And their body starts to distend, and some of them get like really fat, and then they have all kinds of issues, right? Like heart disease and obesity and diabetes and all this kind of thing. So that's from eating too many donuts. If we think about the information environment, like what happens when you consume too much information, right? And are there equivalents? Like, is there low quality information that we love to eat? Kind of like eating donuts. Like I like donuts, right? It's not good for me, but I love them, right?
Yep.
And I like pizza and I like all kinds of stuff that's like, not something you should be eating constantly, right? And with these cell phones that we carry around, right? These second brains, we have access to whatever information we want, right? And whether you call it doom scrolling or you're looking at Instagram thoughts or whatever it is that works for you, right? Like what happens? What's the version of obesity for the information diet?
Yeah. What is information diabetes?
Exactly, right? And how do you recognize someone with that? Now, we could say that, QAnon followers are suffering from a kind of information disease, or, people whose heads exploded during the last presidency when you mentioned the president in any context, right? Mm-hmm. You could say left or right, doesn't really matter. That there are some topics where when you talk about them, like some people, they have a meltdown, right? And if Wolf ever sprinkles really interesting things, you should go read about series Scissor. And this talks about basically a scissor is something that half the population is like, yeah, totally, that's fine. And then the other half like loses it, right? And
so it cuts the population in two is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. You don't know like what's going to be a scissor and what isn't going to be a scissor. And it's just kind of like an interesting concept. And there's a very nice short story by, a horror author about it. And so that's part of it, right? So it's like, okay, what does it look like to have these metabolic diseases in the context of information, right? And then the other thing is that none of us has all the information that we need. It's funny, right? Like I can look up anything on the phone and I can call 3 billion people if I know what their phone number is and they're willing to pick up, but I don't know everything that needs to know. Like I couldn't build the laptop that I'm talking on, right? I have no idea basically how that works. I mean, I actually have quite an idea of how it works, but I really have no idea, right?
Absolutely.
And so I rely on other people. And so we have to make decisions with other people at some level. And so if we're not dealing with the fact that we might be making poor decisions because we're dealing with an overloaded information environment, then you're going to start to see a breakdown in everything, right? Because we have to come to some kind of agreement with other people in order to exist in society, from building things to going to the supermarket to whatever, right? And unfortunately, since communication is a kind of information, and the information environment has changed, that means that our communication environment has changed, and everything, therefore, is part of this topic, unfortunately.
So sense making then is something we have to do collaboratively. It's something, no one's an island. So, I take it then that part of sense making is figuring out how to collaborate and with whom to collaborate, and how to build a better picture of the world. So, but what would you say is like a high level overview of, would you call sense making a set of skills, or how would you characterize it?
Yeah, that's why I said it's an art, right? It's just like it's hard to unpack. And the reason why is everyone innately learns sense making when they're a small child, right? So if you think about a kindergartner who's playing on the playground in the sandbox, they might, you might picture them like moving sand from one area to the other, or like, doing experiments with water, right? Mm-hmm. And as adults, it's really funny when we want to explain things to other people, we always adopt the language of the kindergartner, right? So if we're going to talk about time, we talk about the flow of time. Or if we're going to talk about some abstract idea like solving a problem, we say we're going to go tackle this problem, right? We use words that basically are understandable to the simplest ideas, right? And like, if you think about like all the learning that you've ever done, like the best, Richard Feynman and others, the best teachers, they all make it really simple for us, right? Because sense making in the natural course of events is something that we automatically get as a consequence of growing up, right? It's how you can take a baby from 400 generations ago and grow them up today, and they don't go crazy. But if you took an adult who's already formed a reality and you bring them from 8,000 years ago, their mind would explode instantly, right?
Yeah.
And that's because as we age through different, and this is from the psychology, as we age through different years, our ability for neuroplasticity, which is basically how much your brain can change, and our ability to learn new things, it really decreases. And so sense making is something that 100 years from now, no one's really going to talk about, because like all the little kids will already know all of the things, right? Like when you're teaching your kids about danger and risks and all that, you're using a model of your understanding of the world to teach them. The problem is that our parents didn't have a model that works for us in the environment that we're in, right? Like if I communicate with my grandmother, okay, who, just died recently, she would have me, she doesn't even know about, she knew email was like letters on the internet, and I would have to print them out for her, right? And so the idea that she would be able to explain concepts like, how to use Twitter effectively or when to not trust Wikipedia is sort of not helpful, right? Like, so she couldn't give me advice when I was a little kid, and so I had to figure it out on my own. And as an adult now with small children, I want to teach my kids the same thing. But you know what? I don't really know what's going on, and I like study this. You know what I mean? And so
yeah. I mean, as a Gen Xer, I feel like in many ways, I'm really up on technology. I'm a technologist. In other words, I feel like I'm kind of behind the curve, so socially understanding how young people in particular are learning to make sense of the world right now.
Let me give you an example about why we know the kids are going to be okay, right? So the previous economic formation of the world was something called industrial, right? And you could think of like factories and nation states as being industrial, okay? Mm-hmm. And in an industrial society, the organizations with a lot of power, they tend to look like pyramids, okay? Where there's a guy at the top who gets maximum leverage from all the people below him in the pyramid. Mm-hmm. And so when we asked kids in the 1960s, 11, 12-year-olds, what do you want to be when they grow up? Right? Well, they pick the people at the top of the pyramid. I want to be
Ford or
president,
Edison, yep.
Or the CEO or an astronaut, right? An astronaut is the guy that goes into space, but there's a gazillion engineers who have to build all that stuff, right?
And they kind of stand at the top of that pyramid.
Exactly, right? Everybody wants to be at the top, right? And you might describe it as a ladder or whatever, right? Like, but they know that they want to be at the top because that's where the leverage is and that's where the excitement is, right? And when you ask kids today, what do you want to be? You don't get president, CEO, astronaut. What you get instead are highly connected nodes.
Influencers.
Influencer. You get YouTube star. And they're not able to articulate, like, because most people don't understand, well, why are they choosing YouTube star? That's ridiculous. Wouldn't you want to be the president? But our society has moved from an industrial society to an information society, and in an information society, the dominant structures are not pyramids; they're fabrics where we're all connected together, like neurons in the brain. where we can choose who to connect with or disconnect with. And so what becomes valuable is not the guy at the top, but the person who has the most influence, the most engagement.
Like the spider at the center of the web kind of thing.
The spider at the center of the web, right? And so the kids, they cannot articulate why, but they already know what they want to be, which is, again, the most valuable thing in the entire network, which is the influencer. Now, I don't know what that says about our society, but there it is, right?
Well, in a way, it seems to me that is still the basic desire that's trying to address is still the same, kind of, power and influence is to have control over your environment, but except it's not being done in the industrial way you described. It's being done in a newer way that seems to actually, in many ways, carry more weight in the world right now. Is that way of being an influencer? But it seems to me that there's things that kids aren't getting now that say, you're my generation does, and that there's and bad thinking isn't going away. There's things that I can learn that better. There's things that kids today can learn better. It seems to me that kind of bad thinking is kind of a universal thing, except maybe there's different kinds of bad thinking my generation engaged in versus younger generations are engaging in right now. And is there a way you can kind of characterize, sense making in terms of, say, best practices or good thinking versus, what you're seeing going on, which it needs to be corrective of?
Yeah, exactly. So like, let me give an example. We have this saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the reason why we have this saying is because humans collectively are really excellent at throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? And right now we're in one of those weird periods in history. The last time this happened was like the 1520s, right? We're in this weird period of history where some fundamentals have changed. And as a consequence, we have to revisit all of the heuristics or basic rules, all the models that we use to understand the world, right? To sense make in the world. And so the idea of we need to figure out what's good thinking and bad thinking is actually more important today than it has been for hundreds of years, right? And so part of sense making is coming to the realization that there's not going to be an authority who tells you, hey, this is how you should think about something, or this is what you should think about something. It's deciding for yourself what information, which models are impactful, and then adopting and incorporating those, right? And it's everyone's responsibility because there's no, for themselves, because there's no like institution that exists today that's going to give you good advice. And I think we all sort of understand that at some level. Like, it's funny, I talk to doctors and they tell me like the medical establishment is terrible, right? And then I talk to lawyers and they're like, the legal system is just so screwed up, right? And I talk to engineers, especially software engineers, and they go, I have no idea how the internet works. You know what I mean? Like, right. They're like, it's like tape and glue, and who knows why it works, but it works.
Right? Are you saying that, like, for example, in the case of engineers, it's like, it's I see that it works, but knowing what I know about it, how it continues to work is like it should fail, but it doesn't for some reason.
Yeah, it's kind of like this specific manifestation of what's called the Gel Man Amnesia Effect. And if you're not unfamiliar with that, it's basically this observation, right? You went to like a sports game or something the day before, and you read the newspaper the next day, and you read an article about the game, and the journalist completely gets it wrong, right? They don't have the right score. They don't have like what happened. In some cases, they mix up cause and effect, and you're just like, what the hell? This is a terrible article, okay? And then you turn the page and you read another article about, I don't know, business. You're like, that's interesting. Not knowing that other article and every article in the newspaper is just as messed up as the one that you read.
So amnesia, in the sense that you turn the page and you forget how incredible the story was you just read, implies that there's a level of low credibility about everything in the newspaper.
Exactly, right? And so when you talk to people today, whatever field of study or wherever they're in, they tell you about how the institutions there are just like totally messed up, right? And they still haven't gotten to the point of like accepting that all of the institutions are messed up, and they're messed up because some of the fundamentals have changed, right? And so that agitates for, we are responsible for figuring out what's going to work for us. And it's going to be different for different people, right? And I think that's going to be challenging for folks, and why it's more important than ever to really, try to be as disciplined and intentional about the way that you're thinking as you can be, because you're not going to be able to rely on, the US government's food pyramid to tell you about how to consume information.
Sure. You talk about doctors, understanding that the medical establishment has serious problems and they can't do anything about it. Same thing with lawyers and the legal establishment. But it sounds like those individual doctors and lawyers, they're not just relying on those establishments. They've somehow transcended them on their own. And would you say that's due to their skills at sense making within their environment, at least within those disciplines?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because there's a selection bias, because I'm talking to people who are going to be like me. And so you're right. I don't tend to talk to doctors who sort of take everything that comes from on high as sort of gospel. And I'm being very deliberate in calling them priests, by the way, because in a lot of cases, they've moved away from sort of evidence-based arguments. And actually, you could make the same claim for lawyers as well. I guess you're right. Like the people that I talk to, they still maintain a beginner's mind, if you will. They're still curious and they want to understand things from first principles, right? So if somebody says, bread is the most important thing that you should eat every day, these are the kind of people who go, oh, interesting. Why is that, right? What happens when someone eats so much bread? Or let's run an experiment. Let's do science, right? Let's try to be rational about it. And like, so from my perspective, like you're right, those people are sort of thinking about it. And certainly like that doesn't seem to be the norm, because there's a lot of people who just sort of repeat whatever the high priest says. The
received wisdom. So it sounds like the people you're talking to, they're not relying on the received wisdom in the sense that they're just parroting it. They're actually going out and doing their own critical thinking, their own, surveys of the research and things like that, and maybe they're even researchers and are asking the questions that haven't yet been asked.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you can also talk to like random people and say healthcare and be like, man, this system seems like it has weird monetary incentives, right? And everyone agrees with you. So there is some understanding at every level that the system is like fundamentally dysfunctional, right? And you can talk to basically anyone in the legal profession and say, like, do you think that the criminal justice system is, optimal, right? And they just like will launch into a 9-hour diatribe about how it's terrible, right? And yet there's still part of it, right? So it is an interesting dynamic that you point out, Wolf.
So in terms of sense making, you've described sense making as an art. We've identified there's certain collaborative aspects to it, but if you were to break it down, like say as a set of skills that critical thinking seems to be part of it, but it's bigger than that. How would you what's your what are the categories of sub skills or tasks you would put under sense making?
Yeah, I think this is a hard question for me. So when I teach a class on sense making, and the way that I think about it is that there are a bunch of different perspectives, and each perspective takes on different forms, and you try to integrate the perspectives into your own identity where they work, right? So, I guess zooming back out, whenever I think about, should I think about whether or not this thing is true, I want to ask myself a simple question, which is, if I do all this effort to figure out if someone's lying to me, or if this, new fact that I read is true, will it change an action that I'm already taking?
Mm-hmm.
And if it won't change an action that I'm already taking, and that already taking piece is key, right? If it won't change an action I'm already taking, then I actually try to ignore it. And you sort of already do this today, because I doubt very many of your listeners are concerned with the effectiveness of the weather forecaster in India from yesterday, right? There's all kinds of information we're already not getting. But when I think about how I'm primed for scarcity, right? So I want to consume things because I don't want to miss out on what's happening, right? I want to be in the know, right? It's a social status thing. And when I apply this simple rule, like, do I really care about the results of the election in Wisconsin? It doesn't actually affect me. that sort of gives me permission to let it go. And then I start to get my time back, right? And I start to get more focused. So that would be like one example of, like a hack that I might do, right? Or, another thing that we talk about in my class is emotional triggering, right? So you'll be reading some information, and because you don't have context, a lot of times you'll see an image or a video or some statistic, and it'll make you really upset. And so we talk about, like, why does it make you upset? Do you, coming to an understanding about how it allows you to make you upset, trying to figure out if the person sending this information is trying to make you upset on purpose, right? Do they have an ulterior motive, or they have like a noble motive, right? And try to make you upset, and really breaking down our emotional reactions, because I think we all understand at this point that we're going to get triggered by things in our information environment unless we sort of adopt some kind of, stoic philosophy, right? And so a big part of making better decisions is being aware of the instances when you get emotionally triggered, or you're going to make bad decisions, right? Like when people are tired, they make bad decisions, right? That's why we make pilots go to sleep and this kind of thing, right? Like they're not allowed to fly, 5 days in a row. It's the same when we make, other kinds of decisions. So really, like, getting into all these different perspectives on how we make decisions and where we can, tactically improve. That to me is the essence of upgrading our sense making, while also going into and, sussing out, well, what's fundamentally different today than, say, 5 generations ago, right? Because like you said, the technology is different, but humans are more or less the same as they've always been, right? So what's actually different, so that we can address that aspect of it and go back to those things which serve us. So that was a terrible answer to your question, but I tried.
No, I think I got some important threads out of it. One of which is the idea that we need to be actively filtering. You mentioned the information diet before. We have a pocket full of donuts basically all day. How often do we reach for the donuts as opposed to reach for something that's actually nourishing? Well, what is nourishing? It sounds like you're saying, well, if it has a chance of you changing your behavior for the better instead of just making you enraged, then it's probably more likely to be nourishing. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think that tracks. Is this aligned with your mission? Right. And if it's not something that contributes to your mission, and it's not something that you can affect, don't worry about it.
Wait, I need a mission? What's a mission?
But you know what I mean, right?
No, I mean, I think a lot of maybe some listeners are going, okay, tracks with your mission, but a lot of people don't even know that they should have a mission in life, or or a higher purpose or anything like that.
Yeah, I don't want to make a complete tangent.
Yeah, I know,
I love tangents, but for those of you who don't understand what I mean, is part of taking on that mantle of responsibility is deciding for yourself why your life is meaningful, right? And we all come to a decision about why that's the case separately, and collectively, I think we call this our mission, right? And so some people's mission may be to make great art. Some people's mission may be to inspire through their sports performance. Other people want to become teachers, right? Wolf, at some level, his mission is about informing people and educating them. So he has this podcast, right? So, my mission is about, I want to help people think better. So I want to teach them sense making, right? So these are things that we do and that we spend our time on because they're personally meaningful for us. And collectively, I think we call it our mission. Did I do a good job of describing it? Or?
Yeah, it's just that concept kind of entered the conversation. I think it's an incredibly important concept for people to understand that all improvement requires change, but not all changes are an improvement. So when you said, if we're going to, look at information and filter out what won't change our behavior, it's like, okay, well, what kind of changes should we be seeking? And what is improvement? And you mentioned missions, like, well, yeah, that ties into something greater. So this all kind of ties together top to bottom. That's all I was trying to do there. So how do you personally kind of, you teach a course now, you're becoming, more and more recognized as a teacher of sense making. So what would you say is like a high level overview of your course? How long does it last? And, kind of, how would you describe it?
Yeah. So right now it's 6 weeks long. It's, I would say about 2 to 3 hours a week in a combination of homework and a live group discussion. And it's pretty intense. We're working on making it a little bit more easy for people to get. Right now, it's all synchronous. So it's like a live teaching environment over Zoom. And I'm trying to make it asynchronous, but it's difficult because everybody grapples with these issues in a different way. And so that's like a challenge for me as a teacher. And that's sort of what's fulfilling and nourishing about it. In terms of, if you're thinking about taking the Sensemaking class, so what I would do, so I charge money for the class because I feel like you have to pay for something if it wants to be long-term and durable.
Yep.
And what's really interesting for me is the more money that I've charged, the more seriously people take it and the faster and more easily they have results, right? And so it's like I'm accelerating like the end game of what I'm trying to do, which is basically like I've spent my entire life learning how to think, not what to think, which is different from, I would say, most of society. And I'm just teaching people like, hey, here's things that have been helpful for me from a how to think perspective. And this is how we apply it in a sense-making context. And it's been really working out well for them, right? And you might be asking like, well, why did you decide to do this? And I actually agree with that question. So I'm going to ask that question, even though we didn't ask it.
Go ahead.
And basically what happened was, early on in the coronavirus pandemic, I had set up a really tuned network, information network, a graph, if you will. And by the end of January 2020, I knew everything that we ever learned about coronavirus, save one fact. And that one fact happened on February 5th, which is the guy who probably originally coded the virus was murdered in Nairobi, Kenya. His name's Frank Plummer.
Okay.
And what was so surprising about that is that there was nothing that we've learned since then that was different from what we learned at the end of January, right? And there's always these people who make these sort of, nebulous claims like the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed and blah, blah, blah. And I had sort of always believed that, but I had never experienced it. And with the coronavirus pandemic and being able to actually collect all the information from these really random, far graph information sources to come into some collective whole, and then act on that information. So I published a report. It was like the most incredible thing ever. And then a bunch of people saw that report and, a lot of money was saved, like a lot of money, like a catastrophically lot, like almost $1 billion at this point, which I think is just sort of a ridiculous number. So I'm just always going to say it's a lot of money. People are like, how did you do this, right? What were your sources? And so I was trying to explain to people my sources. And what I realized is that my sources are not helpful for other people. What they really want is my process for creating sources in the first place, right? And for thinking about, well, how do I weigh and measure information? And so I started teaching them that, and that evolved in the sense-making course, and people really like it. And so I was like, all right, I guess I'll teach this now.
So your initial product was the report that helped people save a lot of money by understanding the coronavirus, the pandemic in a deeper way. But your actual process is what people wanted to drill down on. And that process is transferable to, all kinds of other, large problems, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, like literally the process is how do you make sense of huge amounts of information very quickly? And then it turns out that we have huge amounts of information, abundance of information across every category, right? So doctors, they apply all the skills in medicine. Business people, they apply it to all the opportunities that they get, right? Because, as children, and if we think about our entire history as a species, it's always been about the economics of scarcity, right? Like we're afraid of losing something that we already have. And as we mentioned at the top of the podcast, now it's about the economics of abundance, right? And so if you're a business person, it's not like you're only going to get one opportunity and you better be sure to take advantage of that one opportunity or you're going to be poor for the rest of your life. No, it's like every day when you're a business person, you get incredible opportunities. In fact, you're overwhelmed with opportunities. And so how do you pick the one that's going to be most effective for you? Well, that requires dealing with too much information, right? Like being able to reduce the noise and pull out the signal.
So it sounds like we all need to become our own information curators in a sense that, that
exactly.
Even just relying on other people to do it for us is becoming less and less effective in terms of applying it to our own lives.
That's what I think. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't find a lot of people giving me specifically really great advice. Like my mom, she'll give me advice that's like good for me to integrate, but like I wouldn't have my mom run my life. You know what I mean? That's probably the best advice I get too.
Right. So, I mean, what I'm hearing is that, it's like, okay, if we are our information curators, we have to take information from a lot of different sources, that none of which by themselves might be, that great. But together, if we have good sense making capability, we can actually put them together into something that as a whole is much better for us as individuals, or for our businesses or families or whatever.
Exactly. Right. It's fundamentally about shifting from a Newtonian model of the universe to a quantum model of the universe. Right.
Unpack that a bit.
Yeah. So in Newtonian physics, you have cause and effect, right? You have these very simple rules that you can learn. And it just explains, like, let's say 98% of what you observe. And in quantum mechanics, it's freaking crazy, right? And
it's random, it's stochastic, it's jumping between levels of energy, and
exactly, right. And the way that I try to reduce it for people is like it's highly it's like probabilistic, right? So we don't say that something is true or false. We say this is the probability that it's going to affect me, and this is the magnitude of that thing, right? And so thinking about things in terms of probabilities and like Bayesian priors and all this kind of thing. And I understand, like, if you're not interested in statistics, that's hard, but just think of it like, okay, so instead of saying like, this is true and this is false, we're going to assume that everything is true, but it's not going to equally apply. Right. And then the question becomes, okay, what is the most true thing for me? Right. Like, so many of the big discussions in our society are about one person says one thing and another person says another thing, but really it's just a projection of their perspective. And when you actually dig into the nuance of what the person's saying, they believe that it's true, and it's true from that perspective. And it's sort of, you really get messed up, right? And so then the process of understanding becomes kind of like collapsing the wave function of reality at a single point in time and trying to make a determination, as opposed to saying like, X is Y and therefore Y is Z, right? Or, you know what I mean? It's just like, it's not super, things that were true 2 weeks ago, we get new information. It's like, okay, we got to make a 180-degree turn. It's like, it's painful sometimes.
Well, it's interesting because, when we learn how to program computers, this could be a little bit geeky, we learn about values that are true or false. They're called Boolean values. That's all they can ever be. It's true or false. But then we learn about things like fuzzy Booleans that could be somewhere between true, false, or indeterminate, somewhere in the middle. And the way I like to think of things as actually what's called a paraconsistent fuzzy Boolean, where something, you decide how true is something based on the knowledge and how false is it. So you can have something that's very strongly true and false, in which case you have a contradiction. You can have a state where there's no knowledge at all, where you have no knowledge about how true or false something is. And then you have something where something is neither true nor false. And so these things, thinking about things that way, as a gradient of these things speak to the truth of this, and these things speak to the falsity of this, and then realizing that they can be on any of those scales. It's like, that's the kind of cloud of probabilities. And then, the decision you ultimately make, you accept the outcome, and that would be like the collapse of the wave function, whatever it turns out to be. Does that sound right?
No, that sounds exactly right. And so the simpler way that I explain this to non-practitioners is, imagine that you're at the bottom of a mountain and there's somebody at the top of the mountain, and somebody asks both people to describe the mountain. Because their perspective is fundamentally different in relation to the mountain, their description of it is going to be fundamentally different. And they're both true, right? And it's really, and what gets crazy is that most of the things that are really important in human society are just narratives that we tell each other, right? Like money, so much time is spent worrying about money. Money's just a story. This is like not real. Like, when you dig into it, it's like there's a number in a computer system that says how much money I have. And if somebody goes in and flips some bits, suddenly my entire life's work is gone.
I forget who it was that said money is a consensual hallucination or something like that.
Yeah,
we all agree it has value. So it magically has value,
Right. And like, this is like really hard for people. And it's one of the things that I tell them. It's like, it doesn't matter whether Jesus Christ lived and died. Mm-hmm. 1 billion people believe that he lived and died. So you have to just deal with that, right? Yep. And there's so much of that at play. And when you start learning about the power of narratives and how easy it is for people to be led from one narrative to another, and how they're actually believing a particular story makes that story true, it's very, very difficult, right? And obviously as a rationalist, I don't like this, but it's just been my observation that this is what happens. And so, yeah, like there's this huge shift that has occurred where we need to really be clear on, okay, what is the narrative that I'm believing? And is this actually helpful to me, this advice, right? Like, think of it this way, right? If you're getting advice from somebody, wouldn't you want that person to already have the results that you're looking to achieve? Like, nobody goes to a dentist with messed up teeth, right? And so why would you listen to the government who doesn't seem to have your interests at heart about your health? Like, why wouldn't you go to like someone like Wolf, who's like actually like really healthy? You know what I mean? Like you are. I mean, I've met you in person. Like, so like that's going to happen everywhere, right? And like this is like hard for people, I think, and we'll see. Right?
Yeah. So where can people find out more about the courses you offer and and sign up to take your course?
Yeah, so I'm not the greatest marketer, but you can sign up for my email list on my website, michaelguimarin.com, and I make an announcement there when the course goes live, and everybody jumps in, and then it takes anyway. And then the other place that you can follow me is Twitter. Same thing, at Michael Guimarin on Twitter.
And I'll have links to those in the show notes.
Yeah, exactly. And those things are all linked together. That's sort of the best way to find out about me. And I'm really working on trying to like become more available for people. But, this was I did not dream up one day that I was going to be one of those guys selling courses and how to make courses. And just turned out that, this is a really powerful framework. It's easy. And like people are having less stress and more focus. I mean, how can you not like that? Right. So,
yeah. And when it sounds like, as calling, I don't think we choose our callings choose us in many ways. And it sounds like this is something you've been called to raise the bar about this in people's lives and minds. So, and I'm sure as you teach this course, you're deepening your own skills and learning how and deepening your own understanding of this, amazing and critical subject that that we need to incorporate into our daily lives.
That's exactly right. Yep.
So, Michael Guimarin, thank you so much for joining me, and I'm looking forward to hearing other people's comments on this conversation.
Thank you, Wolf. Really enjoyed being here.
Learn more about the world's premier critical thinking tool, Flying Logic, at flyinglogic.com. Help spread the word by rating and reviewing this show on your favorite podcast platform. Discuss this episode at bewareofwolf.com and keep raising the bar, whether the world likes it or not.